Since most of these actions were reported to Sherman, let's look at what developed and how Kump's traits worked against him. As you can see, Sherman and Prentice's divisions are way out in front of the encampment and closest to the rebels. His keen sense of observation sees nothing. His division is made up of raw recruits, and his brigade commanders are green. His inner-directed mind suggests that he knows what's going on, while others he sees as timid and childlike. From his feeling of abandonment, Kump has come to learn that he must depend on his own judgment. Thus, when reports come in from a sizable enemy force, he tells Hildebrand, one of his brigade commanders, who rode out and saw the enemy, that the Rebs are, quote, a reconnoitering party. Later that day, Sherman orders infantry and cavalry units out to scout, which does suggest resourcefulness and cool under pressure. However, when the brigade commander, Buckland, reports contact with the enemy, Kump orders him to take your units back to camp, and he will deal with Buckland later. Another brigade commander had one of his subordinates, one Colonel Worthington, became convinced that the Union forces would be attacked and suggested that they start building a defensive position. He was ignored, but he kept a journal which was later to haunt Sherman. But his loyalty to his peers and senior command kept him from listening to this man who had a reputation of being a worrywart. The first real shots came in the afternoon of Saturday, April 5th. This was not the real attack, which would not happen until the next day, but a serious little fight which was to play on Sherman's psyche. All afternoon, reports of sightings came into his headquarters near Shiloh Church. This caused him some irritation. 31-year-old Jesse Appler of the 53rd Ohio in Buckland's command got reports of butternut-clad troops to his front. Appler commanded the long roll and sent word to Sherman that the enemy was to his front. Appler heard from his courier that the division commander wants him to, quote, take your damn regiment back to Ohio. There is no enemy closer than Corinth. Sherman's behavior may have stemmed from his being labeled insane. To have appeared to be shaken and alarmed would have invited more criticism. In presenting a posture of confidence, he overlooked legitimate cause for concern. At this point, we see the character traits working against him. Early the next morning, the battle began. The traits would now work in his favor. At 6:30 a.m. on Sunday, the Confederates hit Sherman full force, where his division met Prentice's division. Although this was the real thing, the attacking troops were as inexperienced as the defenders, so the advance was not coordinated. As they hit, the aforementioned Jesse Appler was heard to say, "This is no place for us. Retreat and save yourselves." All was chaos along Sherman's front. At 7 a.m. he rode out to Ray's Field, where he realized how wrong he had been, as he exclaimed, "We are attacked." Shots rang out. His orderly fell dead, and Sherman was shot in the hand. At this point, a wounded commander might have retreated or at least gone to a field hospital. Kump made his stand with his troops that had not skedaddled. Of the traits that we have listed, these were the ones that were on display that fateful morning. Objective observer, smart, flexible, inner-directed, prideful, manager of men, cool under pressure, learns from his errors, and resourceful. This was not the turning point in the battle, but it was the turning point in his mind. He kept in close communication with his brigade commanders, winning some fights, losing others. As at Bull Run, his front continued to resist in spite of the panic which plagued a sizable group of his division. The battle ebbed and flowed around Ray's Field. Some of his units stood up to the onslaught in fine fashion, like Captain Allen Waterhouse's artillery. But the weight of the rebel attack was too much so that by 10 a.m. Sherman knew that he could not hold the line. His division was being pushed back from south to north and from west to east, but the move back was causing the Confederates to have committed more troops in this area and not the planned push towards the river. This 4-hour effort paid big dividends for Grant, who had landed and rode out to confer with Sherman first. Grant was pleased with his division's commander and did not stay long. They made plans to form a new line to the north and east along the Hamburg-Savannah Road, also called the River Road. The resourceful Sherman did not just retreat, but made a counterattack along the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road. The reinforced rebel troops made holding that line impossible, but by 4 p.m. Sherman's division was safely behind the new line on the River Road. Although beaten, it was a strong defensive position, with Mulberry Field to its front, and to the west of that lies the ravine of Tillman Creek. Earlier, Sherman had called for artillery support for this defensive position. At about 3:30 p.m., various cannon units arrived and set up shop. Many of these were armed with the highly effective 20-pound Parrott rifles. The Rebs brought up Ketchum's Alabama artillery, and the great artillery duel was fought. After a while, the South tried a frontal assault, which never stood a chance. As the battle shifted to the famous Hornet's Nest, Sherman had stabilized Grant's line. At the end of day one, he has learned from his errors, kept cool under pressure, and demonstrated his flexibility. With Lew Wallace's division and Buell's army on the way, things would be very different the next day. About midnight, Sherman went to meet with Grant. That concluded with the famous exchange. "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant replied, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Sherman was both likable and loyal, and that will serve him well in the immediate future and down the months and years to follow. Before the sun comes up on April 7th, the Confederates are expecting an easy mop-up operation. However, it is now the Rebs who are surprised. Buell, who had crossed the river during the night, opened up on the Union left by the river. In Sherman's sector, Beauregard's troops moved forward into Jones's Field to face Sherman and the fresh troops under Lew Wallace. Grant, sensing weakness, orders Wallace and Sherman to move forward into the fray. At first they were successful, but later on in the morning the Confederates stiffened and started to turn the tide back again. A small note about the aforementioned Jesse Appler and the Ohio 53rd. His unit, now attached to McClernand, had, true to form, broken and ran. So disgusted was McClernand at their disgraceful and cowardly conduct that he ordered the whole unit from the field. Sherman's cool once again contributed to staving off panic, which might have prevailed at 1:30 p.m. Some of Buell's units came to support, and the rebel threat was squashed. By an hour later, Beauregard had thrown in the last of his reserves, and by 3 p.m. it was all over for the South. As you can see from this slide, Sherman did not play a big role during the late morning and early afternoon. This should come as no surprise, as his 8,000-man division had been reduced to 2,500 effectives by the 4,000 who had fled and the rest who had been killed or wounded. Historians continue to argue as to what would have happened if Grant and or Buell had given a vigorous pursuit. Time does not permit me to go into that here. It suffices to say that a perfunctory pursuit was conducted by Sherman on April 8th. He sent out a couple of small contingents that were easily driven off by the rebel rear guard. Later on, he sent a brigade-sized unit out that ran into a small force of Confederate cavalry under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest. The resourceful Forrest ambushed the much larger Union force and got them along with Sherman to flee back to their own lines. None of his character traits came to his aid this time. Almost immediately after the battle, the blame game began. It was clearly a Northern victory, but the butcher's bill was so high that someone had to pay the price. Sherman was spared from being a target, due in no small part to being a friend of Halleck. Halleck was jealous of Grant, and he believed this was his chance to scuttle Grant's ship. Sherman was promoted to Major General, but his loyalty and honesty caused him to speak out when he could have remained silent. Publicly spoke out against politicians and army officers who found fault with Grant. And Grant had one politician whose vote counted the most, the president. Grant never forgot who stood with him after Shiloh. This relationship would last the whole war through and the post-war years. I have but one last story to tell. On a cold and windy day in mid-February 1891, an elaborate funeral was held in New York City for General of the Army, William Tecumseh Sherman. All the important people were there. Among them were President Benjamin Harrison, former Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Grover Cleveland, 30,000 troops, including the entire Corps of Cadets from West Point. One of the honorary pallbearers present, at Sherman's previous request, was an unlikely member, Joseph Eggleston Johnston, a one-time general of the Confederate States of America and Sherman's fiercest antagonist. The two men, with a 14-year difference in their ages, had fought hard against each other during the Civil War, but in later years they had developed a warm friendship, working together to repair the Union that had been rent asunder between the years 1861 and 1865. Johnson's friends were worried about him, for despite the icy winds, his 84-year age and frail health, he insisted on remaining bareheaded throughout the ceremony. Johnston would have none of his friends' protest. If I were in Sherman's place and he were standing in mine, he would not put his hat on.